Hey, welcome to Gothcast. I'm Dr. Sanders, and today I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different. I'm not reviewing an album, I'm not reviewing a movie or a book or anything like that. I'm actually going to do a little bit of a history lesson for you guys, and it's going to be on one of the first, if not the first, goth club that existed, and that is the Batcave in London. And one of the reasons I wanted to make this video is because while everyone kind of knows about the Batcave, if you go onto Tumblr or Instagram or anything like that and you search Batcave Goth, you're gonna come up with the same kind of images, right? The same kind of fashion. You're gonna come up with like fishnets and coffins and kind of what people call trad goth, although I know some people hate that term, but you get what I'm saying if you're familiar with goth things. And I thought it was important to kind of talk about a little bit of the history of goth, especially since there seems to not be that much information about the Batcave out there, especially in some countries. I mean, some countries, if you speak other languages, there's a little bit more information, but here in America there is a lack of it, I feel. And I thought it would be cool to kind of make this video and condense all that into one little thing. Alright, first off, a popular misconception about the Batcave is that it was a specific club when it first started, that it happened every single night, Monday through Friday and Saturday and Sunday. This wasn't the case. It was actually held at 69 Dean Street at the club that was formerly known as the Gargoyle Club and then became Billy's for a short time, and then it was Gossips. And Gossips is where the Batcave finally took hold, and it was in 1982. And of course, what night would you think would be the best for all the creatures night to come out? Of course, Tuesday night. Very, very nice. But actually, Gossips had a lot of different kinds of music. It had funk nights, it had rock and roll nights, I think it even had like a kind of disco-y night. And it basically came to Ollie Wisdom and John Klein from the band Specimen, who had this idea to make a night for basically all the freaks, the people who might not fit in anywhere else, maybe the people who aren't quite into the pop music of the time, and maybe something a little bit spookier. You would enter through a door that had an actual coffin punched out of it. There would be creepy cobwebs and nets and trash bags, stapled onto the wall. And it was very, very low budget in a way. It wasn't this sort of vast, great thing that people might think it is. So if you took the journey up to the 4th story of Gossips, when you enter the Batcave, you might run into quite a few of our favorite goth celebrities today. You might run into Siouxsie Sioux, Steve Severin, Robert Smith, Nick Cave, Nick Fiend, even The Damned. I will say that a lot of people credit Bauhaus, with hanging out there and doing everything, but they actually played when it was still Billy's before the Batcave actually took over and kind of helped to bring that scene into it, which is pretty interesting. But a lot of people today, and even then, kind of shun the goth look and the goth sort of term, and the Batcave was not without its problems. But I'll get into some of the more negative aspects or some of the criticisms that the Batcave drew on in just a little bit. But I do want to talk about the positives. So when the Batcave started, there wasn't really a place for a lot of these darker, freakier people, if you want to call them, to go. And a lot of people felt that it was a safe place for, the freaks and weirdos, just like, all of us today. So by the end of 1982, it had grown so popular that they had to move because the space was too small. So it moved to the subway clubs at Leicester Square, and you can even find some little membership cards and things from that. But then that was too small, so it moved 3 more times. It moved to Faubert's Place, and then it moved to Heaven, and then it moved into the Cellar Bar. That's a good sign, that it was growing to the point of where people, they just couldn't possibly have enough space for all this. Okay, and so you have to remember around this time, from 1982 to 1984, that goth kind of came into its own in a way. People started calling certain albums goth. Bauhaus was often grouped in with that. Anything kind of spooky, dark, pale in a way. But you had The Cure coming out with their 3 albums, the Gothic trilogy. Then you have Bauhaus coming out with their albums, and Siouxsie kind of going a little bit darker. And the Batcave kind of capitalized on that in its own way. They actually released some compilation albums. So you have Young Limbs and Numb Hymns, and then you have The Whip. And I know that this one, you know, Young Limbs and Numb Hymns, is probably the more popular of the two. But The Whip, you know, it's a really good album, but I'm going to talk more about these in their own video. This one's kind of forgotten in a weird way. But a lot of bands that we do refer to as goth, or having been goth at some point, did in fact play the Batcave. In fact, even American bands who, you know, were not anywhere near the Batcave came from afar to play it. And Christian Death is an example of that. They actually played at the Batcave in 1984, and they were actually scheduled to go on, and they had to cancel their first show apparently because of a birth. And I'm assuming that is because Gitani and Valor, you know, at the time were dating, and she gave birth to her child inside of 1984, right around that time, I would assume. So they basically played the next time, and yeah, so in a way, Christian Death is part of the history of the Batcave, even if they were not living anywhere near there. Now, while there was all this positive publicity from, you know, the people who were going to the club and kind of the weirdos, the mainstream and music press kind of tried to lump all these bands together and, you know, kind of keep it under the goth label. And even in worse than that in some ways. But David J. from Bauhaus said it this way, and I think it kind of says something about the bands that were playing there, and, you know, maybe some of the feelings that were going around. He's talking about the bands like Specimen and Alien Sex Fiend. David J. said, "We weren't too impressed. We felt they were a bit one-dimensional and really harping on that schlock horror corny stuff. I think they adopted the goth tag rather than the tag adopting them, as it happened for Bauhaus." You know, that's not a very positive quote from someone who, you know, people would consider part of one of the biggest and most well-known goth bands. And actually, lots of magazines at the time, like NME, was pretty negative. In fact, even in their review of Christian Death, they call the scene at the Batcave the crap cave. And then Sounds magazine, I mean, they didn't really have anything nice to say about them. They would talk about, it's like, oh, at the Batcave you can see the disease-racked kids dancing around and stuff. And when they mentioned that the BBC were filming the special for the Riverside, that's probably the famous footage that most people have seen of the Batcave, you know, that little snippet. They said that the crew were irritated by the lack of any real celebrities. Whatever that means, I mean, yeah. You know, the Batcave was something that, in a way, just kind of lasts till today. I mean, not only do people reference it all the time and talk about how, oh, we're a Batcave influenced band, you know, while most people would not say that at the time, a lot of people are saying that now. In fact, the look from goth actually really evolved out of the Batcave, you know, with the fishnets and the makeup and all this sort of death rock stuff. Really came from Johnny Slepp from Specimen. And a lot of people at the Batcave didn't really dress like Johnny Slepp. I mean, a lot of them had not all black on all the time, didn't just wear black makeup, and there was a lot of influence from pop music, you know, a lot of people who look like Madonna and a lot of things like that. I know it's hard to imagine because the Batcave is seen as this 100% goth all the time, but they did not turn people away. You know, there are some goth clubs, and I'll talk about maybe those in the future, that would turn people away if they didn't really fit the bill. In fact, the people who felt that they were more goth than other people would actually wear little batwing coffin necklaces, and you can even see in some ads and stuff the outfits. You know, they're saying if you want to be like the most goth or whatever, then you can buy these specific things, which is really interesting. You can see how it was really impacting the youth at the time, you know, for a few years. But unfortunately, with any good thing, it, you know, sometimes gets tainted or polluted or kind of changes a little bit, and the Batcave had a lot of this. Inside of 1985, the Batcave, you know, it basically became a tourist attraction for people to come to see, you know, the weirdos, right? And whenever that happens, a lot of people felt that it just wasn't as good, and a lot of people stopped coming to it, and a lot of people who, you know, were the big celebrities going there, you know, Robert Smith and Susie and the Banshees and all them, they didn't really go to the club anymore. And with that, they actually went back to Dean Street. So after all this growth and having to go to different club after different club to grow, they had to shrink back into the smallest club when they first started. And of course, in 1985, they actually closed it and stopped doing it. In fact, Specimen broke up. So they were the house band for it basically, and they were done. So basically the impact of that you have today is the people who went there and the people who saw this and the people who listened to their compilation albums, you know, they kind of kept the spirit of it alive in a way. And, you know, even with Propaganda Magazine and stuff kind of covering some of the people who were from it, it kind of spread out. It's weird, almost like it closed and exploded. You know, people who had been there started their own clubs. In fact, today in Los Angeles, there's a Batcave club that is unrelated. You know, I mean, it's dark and spooky, but it's, you know, as much as it's related, you know, it's not the same owners or anything. But it did have this strange impact. In fact, some people feel who went there that it's a little bit overblown in a way. Like it was this place that was okay, it was cool for a little while, but then it became this touristy thing. I don't know, because I wasn't there. But I will include some quotes from people who were there and want to comment on their time there. Again, from the master of mope, Robert Smith, who we all love, he said, "We used to go to the Batcave because we got in free, and it was a good atmosphere, and the people were really nice. But the music was awful. The whole romanticism of death. Anybody who's ever experienced death firsthand can tell you there's nothing romantic about it." In fact, he's been asked about the Batcave a number of times, and it's always really funny because he just hates it being brought up. He was asked this in a more recent interview. He said, "The Batcave, good grief. The Batcave is how I know I wasn't a goth. Because during the heyday of the Batcave, I was writing songs like Love Cats, and that wasn't exactly the finest goth hour, you know. Specimen and Alien Sex Fiend were the goth bands. The Cure and Bauhaus weren't." That is a super funny quote. But it's actually even more ironic because Pornography was one of the most played albums at the Batcave, probably much to his disdain. And again, giving into the humor of goth, you know, a lot of people have a good sense of humor if they're goth. But David J. also said this about the club: "It goes against the grain of popular perception, but I remember it being humorous. There was a lot of laughter. It was po-faced. It was a laugh, you know?" So, you know, a lot of people didn't take it super seriously. People have commented on how it wasn't just this moody, you know, club that it, you know, a lot of people think it was. In fact, a lot of people try to recreate that sort of atmosphere when they're trying to take on that sort of club. I won't name any, but there's some I know where they just try to go for that just moody, dark, blah blah blah, you know, darkness club. And then, you know, the Batcave, having researched it and watched a lot of videos and kind of looked at what people said about it, it doesn't seem like it was that, you know, you walk in, drink the wine, sit in the corner type of thing. Although there was some of that. Look at videos of Specimen. They seem like they're having a lot of fun, and there was a lot of glam influence, especially at the beginning, before goth really took off. Even in the interviews and stuff, you can tell people just have a good time. And that's great. But of course, Batcave does not exist anymore today, and if you actually want to see where the original Batcave was, at 69 Dean Street, you know what? You can actually stay there in a hotel. At least at the time where I'm making this video. It's not cheap, and even on their website it says like a little blurb about, you know, oh, there's musicians or artists or something like that. It's really funny. Now, one of the things you may be asking me, if you're familiar with Specimen or goth music, is you may be asking me, hey, didn't Specimen release an album live at the Batcave in 2009? And yes, they did release an album called Alive at the Batcave in 2009, but it was not held at the original location, or, you know, it was not like the location was even open. It was held at a different club. And actually, you know, because the Batcave was seen as, you know, just a specific night, it did travel to all these clubs like I mentioned, and it even went to New York instead of 1983 to the Danceteria, and you can even find some footage of that, and that's pretty crazy. I think that this was a really interesting subject to tackle. It was surprisingly hard to find a lot of in-depth information about the Batcave. You know, you would think something that is well known to so many goths today would be covered a lot better, but it really wasn't. I had to kind of pull a lot of sources and books and lots of things like that, and it was really interesting. But next time, we're going to be talking about some albums from the Batcave, specifically one of the compilations, and in fact even Robert Smith might show up in one of the Batcave videos, probably to his dismay. So hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can like, comment, subscribe, and all that, and stay spooky. Bye guys.